Woohoo.
The voice.
Disembodied observer. And I'm going to hit present, share screen. Oh no.
I just gotta let you.
I need permission.
No. Where? Okay, there it is. There you go.
Great. Ha. Okay, so yeah, I'll be quick, probably less than 10 minutes, maybe even less than 5 on sort of bringing together the key themes from these two chapters. But today we are covering chapters 9 and 10 of Bedford's Knowledge Architecture. Knowledge Architectures. Is it plural? Should you pluralize it? No, singular. One architecture, even though she repeatedly talks about architectures in the book. So yeah, chapter 9 is on disposition and destruction. So going into it, I had kind of 2 key questions. What the hell is she actually talking about when she uses the word dispositioning? Because it was a very strange word to use for me in in this context. And then whenever I figured out what disposition was, I wanted to know what kind of decision making do you do around dispositioning? Like how do you do this stuff? And so there are 4, I think, or sorry, right. So first of all, I went into this thinking that disposition is a really weird word. I've heard it like in terms of demeanor, which is not what Bedford's talking about here. She's not talking about, the demeanor or the personality of your knowledge. And I've also heard it in terms of legal dispositions, as in like the final sort of ruling of a judge, right? And that's also not that related to what Bedford is talking about here. She's talking about disposition as in disposing of, but it turns out we're not just talking about trash. We're not only talking about how to get rid of material. There are a variety of other ways of thinking about the final state of a given knowledge asset. And that's really what Bedford's getting at in this chapter. So she defines 4 types of disposition, 4 things you might do. And I'm actually presenting it here in reverse for a reason. I'll get to that in a second. But the 4 types are destruction, discard without reuse. So I'll talk about maybe the difference between those in a second. Repurposing and recycling a knowledge asset, and then preserving an asset. So she says basically that we should be dispositioning our knowledge. We should be thinking about the assets we have and thinking about how long we want to keep them, in what form we want to keep them in, and in what ways we sort of transform them or evolve them or end their life cycle. And that's really the whole goal of this chapter. And these first 2 types seem to overlap a lot to me. She doesn't really do a great job of defining the difference between the 2. It's just sort of a single paragraph on both. But here's how I ended up thinking about it. Destruction is when you really deliberately, permanently want to get rid of something. So you shred the papers, or you use a fancy, I think in practice, you can just, put something in the trash on your computer and empty the trash. But it's when you're deliberately getting rid of something. Whereas discarding without reuse is kind of like, I don't care what happens to this. I leave it in my downloads folder for 6 months, So these are the 2 kind of total trash options in terms of disposition. The third one, I think, is the most interesting. And it's this idea of repurposing and recycling a knowledge asset. So she talks about it in terms of reuse and giving it away. So one example is, say you've got a takeaway, and I didn't really come up with a metaphor in advance of this, but let's say you are, I'm going to continue with my cooking metaphors that I've used in the previous sessions. Let's say you're making a bigger meal. You get a HelloFresh recipe card. So you got that one of those fancy boxes that came with all the ingredients you need to make a meal. And you have potatoes, some kind of protein, and then, some other vegetable, and you love the potatoes. Well, then you don't necessarily need to keep the entire recipe card in order to keep your understanding of how to make that particular side dish, right? You can actually just capture that one thing and then reuse that one thing. So that's one approach to repurposing, is taking a chunk of a knowledge asset that you found useful and then like embedding it somehow in some other stuff you've got. And then the other is giving it away. So say you've got this responsibility to blog about the latest features or review. This is something I've seen in the Apple reviewers, sort of influencers space. There was a guy who used to write a review of macOS every time a major new edition came out. I think it was John Siracusa. And so he'd do all this work, and it was like these really huge reviews. And then one day he just kind of had to give up. And then some other people took on the mantle. So that even though that wasn't a deliberate approach, he kind of had this habit of reviewing macOS, and then when he gave up, somebody else took it over. And that's not really an explicit example of reusing a particular kind of knowledge asset, but I guess it's reusing a procedural knowledge asset, which is one of the types of knowledge that Bedford talks about earlier on. So that's donation. It's like giving away a knowledge asset to somebody else so that they can then take care of it and you don't need to worry about it anymore. And then the last one here is preserving, which means keeping it around. And that's like the whole next chapter. So I'm going to leave that alone for now. So those are the 4 types of dispositions that, or of disposition that Bedford defines. And she does give us some thoughts on how to do disposition. She gives like a complicated 5 steps, but I actually think it's only 2. And the idea here is to look at everything you kind of maintain in terms of your knowledge, define different types or classes. So, if you've got textbooks, you might treat them differently from the recipe cards I mentioned before. And then think about what a disposition schedule is for these different pieces. Like if you're keeping a recipe book of a personal collection of recipes, you might want to actually set up some kind of reminder that if you haven't used a recipe in a year, maybe you don't want to keep that around because it keeps showing up and getting in the way. And in a second, I'll talk about some of the reasons why. I'm actually kind of reviewing the chapter in the reverse order that she presents it in. But that's part of the exercise. So that's one thing to think about in terms of disposition is you might actually have different kinds of schedules for reviewing how you want to keep something depending on what it is. And then once you understand those different types of knowledge and the schedules that you want to keep for their disposition, look at the actual products that correspond with that. Look at the actual assets, look at the recipe cards, look at the textbooks that are on your bookshelf and think, what is the useful piece or what are the useful takeaways from this thing? How should I keep it or should I throw it away? Should I dispose of it? And when or under what conditions do I do those kinds of actions? And that's all that's really involved in the disposition process. So I'll just move on to the next chapter for a second. There's another, I think the most important takeaway from this chapter is still remains undiscussed, but that's part of an exercise. So I'm going to move to this next chapter, cover the kind of topics in chapter 10 that I want to because it's very quick. And then before we end the recording, I'll just walk through the exercise, then we can cut the recording and we can chat for a bit. So chapter 10 is on that 4th type, preservation and conservation. And going into this, I really only had one question. What is the difference between preservation and conservation? Like, why are we defining these different things? And I see Bree is excited. I'm not an archivist, so I don't really care. I went into this being like, why should I care? And I don't know if I necessarily found out, although I do think that Bedford defines a nice difference between preservation and conservation. And that is that preservation is when you want to keep the asset, but you don't necessarily care about any other part of it. So you're trying to preserve, again, that idea of that side you found, the potatoes in that recipe card. You don't necessarily want to preserve the experience of eating the potatoes that first time. Whereas conservation is actually the preservation of both the asset and everything that's attached to it. It's trying to keep the medium as well as the message. So when you're trying to do conservation work, you're trying to preserve the materials that the book came in. You want to make sure that nothing happens to degrade the quality of it. You don't want to save some really long-term data on an SSD, as Bria has talked about, because the bits will fly into the air or something. So conservation is when you really want to preserve the whole experience, the whole package of knowledge. And then preservation is when you just want to keep the asset. And this might seem like a kind of silly distinction, but when you really think about it, and that's part of the exercise that I'll talk about in a second, there are probably actually a variety of things that you're conserving when you don't actually need to be conserving them. You could be preserving them instead. So if you have a bunch of textbooks on your bookshelf, and you are trying to keep them around because they contain some useful information, well, maybe you should actually think about what that information is and then find a better way to capture it in a way that you can access it and consume it more easily later on than just keeping the textbook on a shelf just in case someday, 6 months in the future, you decide to pick up that textbook and flip to the chapter that is the only one that means anything to you, and then look for the diagram that means something to you. So that's the important distinction. We're probably conserving a lot more than we need to when we actually could be intelligent and deliberate about what we're preserving. Okay, so with that, there are those 2 exercises that I mentioned. So to flip back to chapter 9, She offers 4 criteria for disposition, and we're gonna walk through this in a bit between the 3 of us. But for anybody that's maybe watching this later, you can think about it on your own. So the first criteria, so the idea here is that you think about the assets that you have, the knowledge that you've kept around, and you actually, in order to assess their need for disposition, you ask these kinds of questions. So the first is, what is the cost of keeping this? And it could be, for instance, that every time you search for a keyword, let's say, I don't know, trying to think of a good example, potatoes. I'll just keep running with that, with the cooking metaphor. So let's say you have a recipe book. It's a searchable recipe book. It's an app like Paprika. And you search for potatoes in it. And you find these like 12 recipes that you have never made. And that one recipe that you make every single time you search for potato. Well, then there's actually a cost to keeping those 12 recipes that you've never used, or that you have never used again, because it's like a mental cost. There's a cognitive capacity cost to keeping those around. So you might actually want to think about the cost of keeping. It's not just the storage. It's not just the like 2 kilobytes that go towards keeping those recipe cards in your app or whatever, but it's actually the cost of finding the right thing over time, over and over again. So that's the first thing. So what is the cost of keeping this knowledge item? And what kind of cost savings would I have if I got rid of them? The second question is, how does its value diminish over time? So a good example might be if you had a recipe that required some very specific ingredients that you move away from the region that you were in and you can't find those ingredients anymore. Well, then the value of that recipe has declined, and maybe it's less useful, even though it used to be your favorite thing. The third is, what risks are there for keeping it as it is? And just to keep going with this protracted recipe metaphor, what if you had a sentimental recipe, an ex used to make you some kind of potatoes for Valentine's Day, and then you broke up, it was very tragic, and you're with a new partner now, and that's very exciting, but then your partner, sort of finds the sentimental recipe card that you keep on the top of your recipe book, and there's a conflict about it because you're keeping these sentimental pieces around. So maybe that's a risk. And the fourth one is, what harms might it present if it's kept around? And so actually that example I just came up with is probably a harm. A risk might be, I had thought these 2 are very similar to me. I don't know, do you guys have any thoughts on what the difference between risks and harms are while I'm getting my thoughts together? Is there a distinction there to you? No, nothing.
I didn't catch the end of it. My phone just went off.
Okay, yeah, no worries. There's these 2 questions that are the other 2 criteria for disposition: risks versus harms, and they are very similar to me. And I had understood the distinction before this presentation, but now I've forgotten it. I'm trying to remember what the differences are.
Oh, the risks are like for example, like a risk would be like, one, if somebody's going to sue you for continuing to use this equipment, where the harm is like, what harm are you going to cause the patient for continuing to use this equipment?
Right. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah. So harms, actually, you're right, apply to if you keep it in its current state, and that's the keyword there, the current state. So if you keep your medical knowledge in a current state, you're actually preserving your idea of how to treat a tumor as a doctor, or you don't update your food safety, your ideas around food safety. And let's say a new parasite gets introduced that you need to cook your pork to a higher temperature or something. The harms about not updating that as part of the disposition cycle are potentially grave, right? Whereas, risk is the example that I came up with before, the risk of keeping a sentimental piece around that your new partner gets angry about you keeping sentimental ideas around about your old partners, etc. So those are 4 criteria. I'm going to flip back to that in a second once the presentation's over, but just to finish chapter 10, so this idea of preservation versus conservation, I wanted to ask us to think about the last time we actually consciously preserved an asset, as in pulled out the important pieces of a knowledge kernel, instead of just conserving the entire thing, keeping a textbook on the shelf versus actually being deliberate about sitting down and capturing that one diagram that was useful in the entire 600 pages of the textbook. So with that, that's the 2 exercises, this one and this one, and we can pause now and sort of talk about it, but that's the presentation. Thanks.
Thank you.
Don't forget to end the recording.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and do that.